ensure that you have a firm grasp on the requirements. We encourage you to actually read through PROWAG. It's actually a pretty concise document and readable document. So it's a really good idea to actually read through it. So this is a list of the topics that are covered in PROWAG, including pedestrian access routes, curb ramps, at-grade rail crossings, roundabouts, on-street parking, transit stops, pedestrian signals, street furniture, stairs and railings, and the use of detectable warning surfaces, to name a few. And we'll go into some of these today. But it's important to understand that while PROWAG is a major step forward, it doesn't cover every relevant accessibility-related topic or issue in depth. And in fact, on some important topics, it doesn't address them at all. There have been a lot of innovations in the last 30 years since the core of PROWAG was established, and a lot of them aren't captured in the final rule. This includes separated bike lanes, floating bus stops, shared spaces, electric vehicle charging stations, and other newer or less conventional street designs. Like it also includes quick build projects like flex post curb extensions and pedestrian refuges. It includes tactile walking surface indicators other than the detectable warning surface at the truncated domes that everybody's familiar with, such as the tactile directional indicator. This is the surface with the elongated raised bars that can be used to guide people along an accessible route or path to a floating bus stop or mid-block crossing. PROAG also doesn't really address the needs of people with certain types of disabilities. For example, there isn't much in PROAG that addresses the needs of people with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual and developmental disabilities. Finally, PROAG does not address the engagement side of things, engaging people in street planning and design processes, which is really critical in a lot of cases, especially where there is no clear national guidance. And it's something that's very important to us at Tool Design. The guide shown at the right is posted on our website and summarizes some of what we've learned from our experience with engaging people with disabilities in street planning and design. So check that out if you have time. Okay, now I will hand it over to Jeremy to discuss changes from the NPRM.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Jim. So yeah, we'll discuss those changes. I'm sure I will use the term notice of public rulemaking and draft PROAG interchangeably because I've always referred to it as the draft. But yeah, we're going to talk about what's different from previous versions to what was ultimately approved. So let's talk about scoping first of all. The Access Board had received a lot of questions about project scoping and essentially what constituted new construction as opposed to an alteration, as opposed to added facilities. And those three buckets come from the use of terms that have been historically used for accessible building design, but were a lot harder to try to apply to projects in the public rights of way. So as part of the finally approved version of PROAG, it gave more clear definitions of different buckets of project scoping. And the first one is defining new construction as work in undeveloped land, such as a greenfield condition. In these cases, new construction has to fully comply with the accessibility guidelines. And the only exception for greenfield compliance is spaces that are used exclusively by service personnel members, things like vaults and tunnels and other spaces that the public will ultimately not have access to. Those areas do not need to fully comply with PROAG, but all new construction does. Next up is alteration projects, and these are going to be the vast majority of projects in the sort of built-up environment, as they represent projects occurring on developed land. And they define developed as containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or elements. And so, for example, if we had a road that currently doesn't have sidewalk and we're adding sidewalk and curb ramps to that project, we would consider that project an alteration project. And here we're still expected to comply with all of the guidance of PROAG, with the caveat being you don't have to fully comply if there are existing constraints that make that technically and feasible. And technically and feasible is a term that gets used throughout PROAG. But there's a clear definition of that. And so non-compliance with PROAG due to an existing physical constraint, those physical constraints would include things like the underlying terrain, underground structures, adjacent developed facilities or buildings, significant drainage features, or significant natural or historic features. Those are the only things listed as being considered a physical constraint that could push you towards technical infeasibility. But one thing that's absent from this list that was in the previous draft is the availability of right-of-way. So in the past, you could justify non-compliance or not full compliance because right-of-way was not available, but they ultimately removed that, meaning we may need to acquire right-of-way on our projects in order to build them to be fully compliant. When we're not going to comply with PROAG, it's also essential that we document why that design was technically infeasible, noting all the alternatives that we considered and the design process that we went through. It's important to have that paper trail so that if this is ever called into question that something is not in compliance, you have documentation that you complied to the greatest extent that you could. Another notable change was the removal of advisories. Advisories were in the previous draft and had really useful information. It kind of helped to explain things in often simpler terms. But the issue with advisories is that the content contained within them, while useful, was not enforceable. And so ultimately, those advisories were omitted, and most of that content has been rolled into the actual text of the document to help to ensure that it is enforceable. Another notable change was that the previous draft simply referenced the MUTCD. It would point you to it and say your push buttons need to be in compliance with the MUTCD. But now they have taken relevant information from the MUTCD and put it directly into PROAG. So this is going to include topics like accessible push button requirements at signals, as well as requirements for alternate pedestrian access routes during construction. And this is notable because, again, in the past, you could deviate from the MUTCD without needing to document technical infeasibility. But now that it is included in PROAG as an accessibility issue, we have to do our due diligence and ensure that we're complying to that greatest extent possible. Finally, it also clarified that alternate designs, products, and technologies that generally comply with or are greater in accessibility are permitted even though they're not directly discussed in PROAG. So one notable change that jumped out to us as we read it was relating to alternate pedestrian access routes. These would be temporary access routes to get through construction zones or to avoid sidewalk closures, things of that nature. And essentially, the approved version says you still need to have all the width and slope requirements of any accessible route. It also pulled in some of the content from the MUTCD on this topic, but the notable change was the requirement to have a sign at decision points that conveys information to a person in a non-visual format. So essentially, the requirement to have a passive detection sign with an audible message that will tell somebody who can't see a sidewalk closed sign that the sidewalk is closed ahead and to cross here. And there's clear requirements on this that it has to be placed in advance of decision points. So if the sidewalk is closed mid-block, you would want to ensure that these audible signs are posted at the corner where a pedestrian would need to cross in order to continue along that route. This has always been in the MUTCD. However, it was listed as an optional treatment, but now included in PROAG, it's stated as required. Many contractors are not going to be familiar with these devices. So on the slide here, there's two products that Minnesota DOT has had approved for a very long time. They come from reputable manufacturers. Honestly, these are very small devices and are not going to be extremely costly, but it will be a change in the way that we approach construction support, ensuring that we're checking this as part of construction inspection, that we're documenting this in project specifications and general notes so that the contractor is aware of this requirement. With regards to curb ramps, PROAG still requires one curb ramp or a blended transition to access each crosswalk. That's including marked and unmarked crosswalks. It clarifies that you need to have a landing space anywhere where a pedestrian is expected to make changes in directions, typically at the tops of a curb ramp and many of the curb ramp types. It also clarifies that we need to have a 4-foot by 4-foot clear space at the bottom of curb ramps. Now, clear space is different than a landing in that it doesn't have all the same sloping requirements, but it does mean an unobstructed space that facilitates that movement from a pedestrian in the street to be able to access that curb ramp. It also specifies that that clear space cannot be in conflict with a concurrent motor vehicle or bicycle movement. And this is going to be most relevant to diagonal curb ramps, which we'll talk about in a second. But that is a stipulation of the clear space design. And then finally, it includes design guidance for our most steep conditions where the change in grade at the bottom of a curb ramp would exceed 13.3%. In those cases, we need to have a short transitional space so that a person's footrests won't bottom out as they try to traverse a very steep condition. Another notable change that really jumped out to me is the actual design requirements for curb ramp landings. And what the guidance actually says is sort of misunderstood from what past drafts had said. It clarifies that we need to have a 2.1% maximum slope in the direction that is parallel to the curb ramp, but the slope perpendicular will need to be equal to or less than the cross slope of the curb ramp itself, which in effect is the same as the cross slope of the roadway. So this is an area where every DOT that I am aware of currently has standard details that say you need to have a they say 2% slope in both directions, and some guidance says in all directions, which would be taken to mean measured diagonally through the landing. But PROAG is explicit that that 2.1% slope is only required parallel to the curb ramp. And if we go to the next slide, I think this is a common design that we've seen in the past where designers would try to warp a ramp to develop a fully flat landing at the top of that curb ramp. And that had always been my understanding as well. I did reach out to the access board to get clarity on this, and they reinforced that not only is that incorrect, but they discourage the use of warping on curb ramps and instead would prefer to see any significant warping that is needed, that warping occur within the street itself. And we'll talk about some of the cross slopes for crosswalks shortly, but this is a fundamental change in design, in my opinion. I would also note that on a shallow sloped roadway, so for example, a road that has a longitudinal slope of 0.35%, because that cross slope on the landing needs to be less than or equal to the roadway cross slope, designing that at 2% would be incorrect and not in compliance with PROAG. So this is something we'll need to be looking at both on the design side as well as on the inspection side to ensure that we are in compliance with our curb ramp designs. Jim, if you just click one more time, essentially this is what the guidance is saying, that we should be matching our roadway profile slope in that direction that is perpendicular to the curb ramp. And explicitly for curb ramps like the one depicted here, where it's actually one landing that serves two curb ramps. You can see the detectable warning that's kind of hidden behind the utility pole here. In those cases, the PROAG is explicit that the slopes in both directions should not exceed the roadway profile slopes for that corresponding roadway. So what's shown here is actually what they intended as part of the design requirements. Nothing fundamentally changed with regards to the design of directional curb ramps, but I do think it's important to understand this. So when we're providing a directional curb ramp, that's one that is not perpendicular to the curb line and is usually installed to better align our curb ramp with our direction of crossing. That requires us to have this transitional triangular space at the bottom of our curb ramps. And if that distance from the curb to our grade break is less than or equal to 5 feet, PROAG's explicit that those detectable warnings should be placed at the bottom of the grade break. But in those weird skewed conditions where that distance would exceed 5 feet, they want the detectable warnings to be placed along the back edge of the curb line. So again, this is what the drafts versions previously said, but an important thing to be thinking about in design. With regards to blended transitions, again, one of the two types of curb ramps that are acceptable for accessing crosswalks, it stipulates that that maximum slope for the ramp can't exceed 5%, and where there is a continuous sidewalk network that would wrap around that corner, that we need to be maintaining an accessible bypass area. So that would be a 2.1% max slope and at least 4 foot wide, so that somebody that is trying to go around these corners does not have to interact with the steeper 5% portion. So again, PROAG is explicit that it's either a curb ramp or blended transition that's needed, and reinforces that a single diagonal curb ramp is only permitted if two separate ramps or a blended transition are technically infeasible. And again, in those conditions where a diagonal ramp is provided, that landing space at the bottom of the ramp cannot be in conflict with a concurrent bicycle or motor vehicle movement, which usually creates a problem for diagonal ramps, that you often need a very large corner radius in order to have that space that's not in conflict with other moving traffic. So again, it's a last case resort where the preferred designs are technically infeasible. Another notable change was the requirement that at stop-controlled or yield-controlled driveways, detectable warnings are required. And so that's if the driveway has a stop or yield sign, or if it is signalized. In those cases, detectable warnings should be included across the full width of the pedestrian accessible route at those driveways. And this is one where I think there are going to be plenty of instances where existing stop signs have been installed on driveways, even though they potentially weren't warranted. And so as we're reevaluating and making alterations on projects, we should also be evaluating whether it's actually a high volume driveway that necessitates the inclusion of that stop sign. If not, then we should be removing, existing stop signs that aren't warranted, and therefore not including the detectable warnings at those locations. PROAG also provided some additional guidance for constructability of detectable warnings, that they recognized through the commenting period that certain detectable warning systems cannot be installed without a small concrete border to allow them to be fully stable. And so it does provide the provision that there is a 2-inch maximum concrete band that can be provided for constructability around the edges of detectable warning surfaces. Another notable change related to detectable warnings, and we'll certainly talk about this more once Jim starts talking about accessible parking, but it specified that detectable warning surfaces are not required for curb ramps used exclusively for on-street parking or passenger loading. And this differs from the previous draft that said they are required. I'll note, though, that it says they are not required, but does not say they are prohibited. And so I believe it's currently the county's policy to continue to use detectable warning surfaces on these types of curb ramps, because failure to do so would mean that a pedestrian could potentially wander out into the street without knowing as such. But our recommendations to any agency are to ensure that you're using a consistent policy so that pedestrian expectation in the public rights of way is consistent. With regards to crosswalks, it discusses both the grades and cross slopes of crosswalks, and I want to make sure that we keep these terms straight. The grade of a crosswalk is the same thing as the cross slope of a roadway and vice versa. So when PROAG is talking about the grade, they're talking about the grade in the direction of a pedestrian that is walking across that crosswalk. And PROAG specifies that a 5% maximum grade should be used, with the only exception being on a roadway that is super elevated. In those cases, you can match the super elevation rates. With regards to cross slopes, those requirements are based on the type of crossing that we have. So 2.1% is required at stop and yield controlled intersections. 5% cross slope is the maximum at uncontrolled intersections, as well as those that have signals and pedestrian hybrid beacons. And then at mid-block crossings, we can match the existing roadway grades. I'll note that that 2.1 slope requirement is notable because the access board had received a lot of comments about that, with concerns that it's not constructible in the real built environment. Reading through the preamble of PROAG, the access board recognizes that a 2.1% slope will not always be achievable based on our project scopes, but where we are making changes to grades, we should be adjusting them to ensure that we are complying to the greatest extent practicable. PROAG also provides guidance on when we're not providing pedestrian crossings, where they're prohibited to cross, stating that a curb ramp shall not be provided, and you either need to have a landscaped edge or some sort of vertical detectable edge. So in the case of the vertical detectable edge, they're referring to something like a fence or railing, and as part of those requirements, they specify that the bottom rung of that system can be no higher than 15 inches off the edge of the off the surface of the sidewalk to ensure that it can be reliably detectable. Roundabouts, multi-lane roundabouts, and multi-lane channelized turns were another place where the guidance from the previous draft and the approved version have some differences. So the previous version said these conditions require signalization. The approved version states that one or more of the following is required, with that list including a signal, a PHB, a rapid flashing beacon, and or a raised crosswalk. And so that essentially means that there are going to be some locations where we need to include more than just one of those things. For example, using a raised crosswalk and a rectangular rapid flashing beacon may be the appropriate approach based on the conditions that we're going to encounter. However, PROAG does not provide any guidance on making the selection of what treatments should be used. So on the next slide, This is an example from the MassDOT roundabout design guide. It's consistent with what we see in PennDOT and Montana DOT's design guidance. And this is similarly referenced in the most recent NCHRP document referring to roundabout design. So this was developed prior to the adoption of PROWAG and therefore shows examples of simply marking a crosswalk. If we do a quick click on this slide, we've modified this to show what a potential starting point might be now that we have to at least include a raised crosswalk, RRFB, or PHB or signal. But again, this is just a potential starting point and recognize that we need to evaluate each location based on the conditions that a person will experience. As a point of reference, even in the existing MassDOT guidance, it says that at some single lane roundabouts where it's high volume, high speed, and or a high noise environment, it may be appropriate to signalize even a single lane roundabout crossing. So we do need to look at this based on PED volumes, noise, and all the other contextual elements to make the appropriate decision on those crossing treatments. With regards to accessible push buttons, it reinforces that APS push buttons are required at all signals that include a pedestrian signal head. So the requirement to have the push button is directly tied to the presence of a pedestrian signal head. Those are going to be any traffic signal or pedestrian hybrid beacon that includes those treatments. This was previously optional, but it is now required. And an APS push button does have specific requirements that it has to include an audible and vibrotactile message, has to include a locator tone, and must include a contrasting tactile arrow that aligns with the direction of the crosswalk. It's still needed even if you're using passive detection or pre-timing of the signal. And again, this is to ensure that a pedestrian is still provided that audible and vibrotactile information if they're not able to see the pedestrian signal heads. Now, because this is tied to the provision for pedestrian signal heads, this doesn't mean go and remove all your pedestrian signal heads so that you don't need to have push buttons. Again, remember that this is minimum guidance, and we know that pedestrian push buttons that are accessible provide useful information for people navigating the environment. So we really need to be striving to include these. The Access Board declined to provide any guidance on what would trigger the installation of an APS push button. They noted that this is typically governed by the same alteration requirements as any other pedestrian facility alteration. It's possible that the DOT or DOJ may provide some additional guidance related to these triggers. In the past, triggers are basically tied to a project scope. So for example, Caltrans, California's DOT, they already have a trigger for the installation of APS push buttons that includes when somebody requests them or when electrical work is being done on those signals. So again, having a consistent policy that you can rely on while also recognizing there are going to be times when you're out there installing a new curb ramp, you're digging up the sidewalk, and even if you're not required to put the APS push button in, you're already disturbing the pavement, and it may make sense to do it now rather than a year down the road when you're doing a little bit of signal work and then you got to rip up the sidewalk again. So think also of the optics from the public's perspective of, are we digging things up multiple times unnecessarily? On this slide, we're talking about RRFBs or other types of beacons, and noting that those locations also require the inclusion of accessible push buttons or passive detection in order to activate those lights. However, These devices cannot say walk sign is on. They simply need to note that the flashing lights are on because there actually isn't a walk indication at these types of locations. They're also slightly different than the push button used at signalized intersections because while they have audible information, they do not have vibrotactile information because the vibrotactile communicates that there is a walk indication for a pedestrian. So another slight nuance for beacon style locations. With regards to shared use paths, the access board updated the definition to reinforce that these are paths for transportation purposes. And so this differs from paths that are exclusively for recreational use, would not fall under the category of shared use path and would not fall under the guidance of PROWAG. But with regards to shared use paths, it reinforces 5% maximum slopes, except at over and underpasses where you can design them with ramps and landings, which they similarly provide design guidance on. It does also permit the inclusion of bollards at the bases of these sorts of over and underpasses, as long as there is a minimum 4-foot clear space between that bollard and the nearest adjacent obstruction. However, tool design would caution you against installing bollards, except at the locations where they're absolutely necessary, because they similarly serve a safety risk for bicyclists that, if struck, can cause serious and life-changing injuries. And then a notable change, the guidance for ramps stayed the same. You're allowed to have a maximum rise of 30 inches before you need 2.1% landing area. And the notable change was with regards to stairs. So it requires that we include a 1-inch wide, visually contrasting stripe on the treads and the top landings. And so that has to be visually contrasting, either light on dark or dark on light. Next up is pedestrian accessible routes or pedestrian access routes. So we'll walk through that concept. And it's important to recognize that PROAG includes two separate terms that have very different meanings. One of them is pedestrian access route, which is the accessible route that is unobstructed for use by pedestrians with disabilities. Then they have a separate definition for a pedestrian circulation path, which is a prepared exterior or interior surface that is provided for pedestrian use in the public rights of way. So if we look at this image on the right, you can see the access route is that central unobstructed band that is intended deliberately for people with disabilities to navigate the right of way. The pedestrian circulation path would include not only the pedestrian access route, but also that frontage zone and furniture zone, because those are similarly intended for pedestrian use. It provides guidance on the scoping of pedestrian access routes, and this is going to include our sidewalks, shared use paths, even paved shoulders in some cases, as well as the curb ramp and crosswalk that are used to transition across streets, and those median refuge spaces in the middle of road. Finally, pedestrian accessible routes also refer to the at-grade rail crossings and those over and underpass designs. And I'll note that this isn't actually discussed in PROAG, but reinforcing that shoulders are not going to be a suitable pedestrian access route in a suburban and urban context where we have lots of vehicle movement and lots of pedestrian activity. The importance of providing a separate pedestrian accessible route, separate from the roadway, is an important component to address the comfort and safety of people navigating the street. Also want to stress that We should be paying attention as we're scoping projects to look for clear worn paths where pedestrian activity is clearly present, which reinforces the importance of providing an accessible route so that those with disabilities have the same access as those that can traverse those less traversable surfaces. With regards to the accessible route, grade or running slope is measured in the direction of pedestrian travel. If we're in the street right of way, that grade cannot exceed 5%, or the grade of the adjacent street, whichever is greater. And we're allowed to exceed that 5% only when the street has a steeper slope than that. And then outside of the street right of way, and again, this is going to refer to often shared use paths that are in their own alignment. In those cases, the grade cannot exceed 5%, period. And the only exception to that is when you do interact with a street crossing. In those cases, the crosswalk grade may exceed that 5% if it's super elevated or mid-block. With regards to cross slope, I've been throwing around the term 2.1% pretty regularly, but that is a new requirement as part of PROWAG. The drafts always said a 1 to 48 maximum slope, but then identified that as a 2% slope. In reality, it's 2.08. And we recognize that digital levels typically don't go to 2 decimal places. And so for measuring compliance, we'll be held to 2.1% as the maximum slope. And again, cross slope is measured perpendicular to the direction of travel and has those requirements that differ when we deal with crosswalk locations. And then with regards to the surface of an access route, PROAG simply says that it needs to be firm, stable, and slip resistant, and it doesn't go beyond that. That said, typically this is going to mean either concrete or asphalt. Yes, well-maintained and installed brick or a well-maintained and installed, flagstone could meet this requirement, but it's going to require proper installation to ensure that we're not going to have settlement, and it's inevitably going to require more maintenance than simply a concrete or asphalt condition. There's lots of types of pavers that will not meet this requirement. If they're beveled or pillowed, they're inevitably going to be too rough or uncomfortable for somebody to roll over. And then similarly, even some types of concrete where they have a significant amount of exposed aggregate are potentially going to have those same roughness concerns, which are going to be difficult for somebody with brittle bones or a spinal cord injury to navigate. And then PROAG also speaks to grade breaks and changes in level. So grade breaks, think of at the tops and bottoms of curb ramps. Those have to be flush. There cannot be a lip associated with a grade break. But linearly along a pedestrian accessible route, there are some allowable changes in level that less than 1/4 of an inch can be a vertical face. Between 1/4 and 1/2 inch needs to be beveled. More than that has to be treated as one or the other type of ramp, either 8.3 or 5%. This is typically going to be useful for you in evaluating an existing sidewalk and potentially grinding down some lips that currently make accessibility a non-compliant feature. We can grind them down to meet these requirements. And then PROAG also speaks to horizontal openings. And so where we have drainage grates that are within the accessible, or actually within the circulating path, that can't allow a sphere of 1/2 inch to pass through it. So it's a very different type of catch basin or inlet grate than what we typically see in the street. And there is some different guidance for roadway flange gaps. that it's either 2.5 or 3 inches, depending on what type of tracks we are crossing, whether they're regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration safety regulations or not. And then the last topic I wanted to touch on here was protruding objects. And so a pedestrian accessible route needs to be fully unobstructed to ensure that it will be in compliance with PROAG, but even pedestrian circulation paths cannot have obstructions that somebody can inadvertently bump into. And so that means things can't be less than 80 inches because people tall like me will bump their heads if we're walking in the pedestrian circulation path. And then objects need to be less than 27 inches so that they can be reliably detectable to somebody who is swinging a cane. And if we look at the next slide, sort of illustrating some of these concepts, the image on the top shows some protruding objects. So we see a drinking fountain that's sticking out into the pedestrian circulation path, as well as those signs and planter boxes. So the bottom image shows a different style of drinking fountain so that it's not protruding more than 4 inches. That planter box would need to be omitted and the sign raised so that you wouldn't strike your head on it. I will note that the image on the top could be retrofitted. So Jim, if you do one more click. So you could install a planter box under that existing planter as long as it's 2.5 inches or more high. Then that existing planter could protrude out as much as 4 inches from that planter box. That wouldn't fix the sign issue, but there may be opportunities for retrofitting is the takeaway from that slide. And with that, I will pass it back to Jim to talk about accessible transit stops.
Right. Thank you, Jeremy. All right. So accessible transit stops. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the requirements in PROAG for boarding and alighting areas. And those apply specifically to sidewalk and street level transit stops. So we're not talking about metro stations or anything like that. First, compliant boarding and alighting areas are required for each accessible vehicle entry. This is a clarification from the NPRM, or proposed rulemaking, which said that transit stops serving multi-car vehicles should have compliant boarding and alighting areas, and didn't really specify what that meant. So this clarifies that. Boarding and alighting areas must have a minimum clear length of 8 feet measured perpendicular to the street and a minimum clear width of 5 feet measured parallel to the curb. PROAG requires that boarding and alighting areas be connected to existing pedestrian circulation paths by pedestrian access routes complying with PROAG R302. Those are the requirements that Jeremy just introduced. This means that you can't put down a concrete pad out on the side of the road and not connected it to a sidewalk or some other type of pedestrian circulation path. It could be a shoulder in rural areas, although that's not ideal. In addition, if your stop includes a transit shelter, you need to provide a pedestrian access route that goes to the shelter. And finally, while the boarding and lighting area can overlap the pedestrian access route, bus stop signs and shelters may not. A minimum clear width of 48 inches must be maintained. So that's the pedestrian access route requirement. And that's, as Jeremy was describing, it's a 3-dimensional space that's unobstructed. If sidewalk constraints prevent the 48-inch clear width and the sidewalk cannot be widened, the post or shelter may need to be relocated to the back of sidewalk or the shelter omitted. Here's a bit more on boarding and alighting areas. First, if boarding and alighting areas coincide with a sidewalk and the sidewalk is not 8 feet wide, boarding and alighting areas must extend beyond the sidewalk. If that's infeasible, the bus stop is considered not accessible and should be moved to an accessible location. Next, the slope of boarding and alighting areas parallel to the street must be the same as street grade. This makes it easier for example, to set down the wheelchair ramp at the right angle It's also an update from the NPRM, which specified the slope parallel to the street as 2%. The slope perpendicular to the street remains 1 to 48, which has now been rounded up, as Jeremy mentioned, to 2.1% in the final regulation. Note that it's recommended, and this is something that Jeremy had on previous slides, but it's important to state, I think, that when you're designing to meet these requirements for cross slope, that you should really design for 1.5% or so to allow for construction tolerances, because things don't always go according to plan in the actual construction. Finally, some people get confused about bus stops and whether detectable warning surfaces are required. PROWAG says detectable warning surfaces are required for rail stops for the entire length of the platform. However, detectable warning surfaces are only required at bus stops if it is above standard curb height. That's the term that PROWAG uses. And they define it as the typical height of a curb according to local standards for a given roadway type, which it says is usually between 3 and 9 inches. Now let's talk about transit shelters. As mentioned before, there must be a pedestrian access route connecting between transit shelters and boarding and alighting areas on or boarding platforms. There must also be a clear space measuring 30 inches by 48 inches entirely within the shelter where a person in a wheelchair can wait for the bus. In cases where this space is confined on all or part of 3 sides, which applies in a lot of cases in shelters because you've got walls on the shelters, you also have to provide additional maneuvering space so people who use wheelchairs and other mobility aids can turn into and out of the space that's provided for them. If environmental controls such as heating or cooling systems are provided inside a shelter, they must be proximity actuated, meaning a person must be able to trigger them by their mere proximity to the shelter and not by a push button or other triggering mechanism that would require a person to know that the triggering device was there. Finally, any operable parts that are provided within the shelter must meet the requirements for operable parts in PROWAG R403 and comply with related clear space and reach range requirements. In Montgomery County, a lot of shelters have push button activated audible real-time bus information. So what this is saying is that you need to be able to trigger those push buttons with a certain amount of pressure. They need to be with a certain within a certain specified height range, and there needs to be a clear space next to them from which you can activate the push button. Signs that are provided at transit shelters must comply with the requirements in PROAG R410 for finish, contrast, fonts, text size, and other characteristics. And I'm not going to go into them all, but just to give you an idea of what some of these requirements are like, PROAG specifies that characters and their background must have a non-glare finish. Characters must contrast with their background with either light characters on dark background or dark characters on a light background. And characters must be conventional in form. They can't be italic, oblique, script, highly decorative, or other unusual forms. There are some exceptions. Schedules, timetables, and maps are accepted from these requirements. And finally, the protruding objects and vertical clearance requirements discussed earlier also apply to bus stops. So they can't protrude, there can be no protrusion at all into the pedestrian access routes at a bus stop or any other place. So that's important to remember. Finally, related to transit stops, if a transit stop is temporarily not accessible, for example, due to construction, an alternate transit stop that meets the requirements I've just discussed must be provided, including a pedestrian access route that connects the stop or the boarding and alighting areas of the stop to the pedestrian circulation path. It's also important to think about how people will get to these alternate stops once the the original one is closed. And remember that proximity activated audible messaging or other non-visual messaging is required at decision points. So these should provide direction to alternate stops if they're provided. Okay, next I'm going to talk about accessible on-street parking and passenger loading zones. The requirements for accessible parking apply to on-street parking that is metered or designated by signs or pavement markings. The table on the slide shows the number of accessible parking spaces that are required for certain quantities of metered or designated parking spaces. It shows that if you have 1 to 25 spaces, for example, at least one of those spaces must be accessible. If you have 26 to 50 spaces, at least 2 of those spaces must be accessible, and so on. Where there are block perimeters, the minimum number of accessible spaces required is calculated based on the number of metered or designated spaces you have on the block perimeter, which PROWAG defines as the near side of the streets surrounding a block. Where there aren't block perimeters, you still need to provide accessible spaces based on the table, and this is a clarification from the NPRM. In both cases, where individual spaces are not marked, each 20 feet of block perimeter or street length, as it may be, in cases where you don't have blocks, counts as one parking space. Parking spaces specifically designated as residential or for the exclusive use of commercial or law enforcement vehicles are exempted from these calculations. Finally, in the case of alterations, the calculation shown here only applies to the number of spaces that are altered. If you alter one space, it needs to be an accessible space. If you alter 25 spaces, you still need just one accessible space, even if the total number of spaces on the block perimeter is much higher than 25 spaces. So that's important to keep in mind. The Access Board has made some adjustments to the requirements for accessible parking space design. First, with respect to parallel parking spaces, the adopted PROWAG requires that the access aisle must not the access aisle, but rather the parking space itself must be 24 feet long and 13 feet wide. This differs from the previous draft that required 8-foot by 20-foot spaces with a 5-foot access aisle between parking spaces and room for a person exiting on the driver's side of the vehicle to get to the aisle without having to go into the travel lane. So they've taken out the access aisle requirement, and they've done this to allow the driver to situate the vehicle anywhere within the full width of the space so the person with a disability may exit the vehicle on whichever side is needed without exiting directly into a traveled way. Some people with disabilities will need space on the driver's side of the vehicle outside of the travel way, so they're now able to park closer to the curb. Although many people with disabilities do not drive, some, including some wheelchair users, are the ones who are doing the driving and they need that space. Perpendicular spaces, there's been some changes there as well. Perpendicular spaces have no width requirements, but require an 8-inch or 8-foot access aisle. If you have the option to park either head in or back in, then one access aisle can serve 2 spaces. If only one-way parking is permitted, the access aisle must be on the passenger side. Angled spaces must be 11 feet wide and must have a 5-foot wide access aisle. Note that the 16 feet of total width you get with this provides 8 feet for the vehicle plus 8 feet for ramp deployment. And finally, it's important to understand that these dimensions are only required if the parking space and the sidewalk are being altered. Also, there are some exceptions to the dimensional requirements for parallel parking spaces, which I'll discuss on the next slide. The exemptions you see on this slide are for parallel spaces, as I mentioned. The ideal design is to provide a curb ramp to directly access the sidewalk and provide a 13-foot wide parking space. However, if the adjacent pedestrian route, in most cases it'll be a sidewalk, isn't being altered, you can match the typical parking space width. To keep it at 8 feet, for example, if that's what the parking your parking lane width is. There's also an exception for if you have insufficient right-of-way, which PROWAG describes or defines as 9 feet from the curb line to the right-of-way line. In both cases, the parking space must be located at the end of the block face or adjacent to a mid-block crosswalk with curb ramp so that a person getting out of a vehicle can use the curb ramp at the crosswalk to reach the sidewalk. There are lots of conditions, and this is a graphic that you saw earlier. There are lots of conditions that aren't addressed in PROWAG, like accessible parking adjacent to separated bike lanes, the design of which requires careful thought and attention. Shown on the slide is what we included in the upcoming new edition of the AASHTO Bike Guide. However, given the requirement to mark the space as 13 foot by 24 feet, something like this updated graphic is what we'll actually need to mark to both meet the written text of PROWAG and accommodate the myriad of uses at the accessible parking space. This will likely work in most cases, since people will generally only park along the edge of the painted buffer if they're a person exiting the driver's side. Only on the edge of the buffer if they're a person exiting the driver's side and setting their wheelchair next to the driver's side door. Most other users will park closer to the edge of the travel lane or in the middle. In the rare case where a person parks toward the edge of the bike lane, however, there is the potential for dooring in this situation if someone gets out of the passenger side. So to address this, wherever feasible, you should include a 2 foot or 3 foot wide striped buffer area between the bike lane and the parking space, recognizing that in constrained conditions, this may not be feasible. Parking meters and pay stations associated with both accessible and standard parking spaces must meet the requirements in PROWAG for operable parts. For example, you need to provide a 30-inch by 48-inch clear space adjacent to the meter or pay station, plus additional maneuvering clearance if the space is confined on 3 sides. The parts have to be between 15 inches and 48 inches off the ground. This is so that you don't get issues like you see in the upper right-hand photo where the person in the wheelchair can't reach the buttons. The parts can't require tight grasping, pinching, twisting of the wrist, and the force required to activate them can't be more than 5 pounds. And there are several other requirements related to operable parts, but this is just to give you a sense of what those are. The requirements for passenger loading zones are similar in a lot of ways to the requirements for parallel parking spaces. In this case, you're required to provide an accessible passenger loading zone for each 100 feet of space along the street that is permanently designated as a non-transit passenger loading zone. The permanently designated part is a change from the NPRM to clarify that the passenger loading zone requirements do not apply to passenger loading zones that only operate during certain times of day, for example, a valet stand that is set up for a special event. In terms of dimensions, accessible passenger loading zones must be at least 8 feet wide and 20 feet long, and there must be a 5 foot wide access aisle at the same level as a loading zone marked to discourage parking. Finally, similar to the requirement for accessible parking spaces, there is now a requirement that the center 50% of sidewalk adjacent to the parking space is obstruction free. So that means no parking meters, no trees, nothing like that. And this is so that a ramp can be deployed onto the sidewalk. Finally, there are a few common requirements that apply to both accessible parking spaces and accessible passenger loading zones. First, connections between the street and sidewalk need to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. These connections also cannot include changes in level, so that's a little difference from the standard requirements for a pedestrian access route. They have to be completely smooth. Second, if a curb ramp or blended transition is needed to transition from the sidewalk to an accessible space or passenger loading zone, you must provide it, of course, but the curb ramp or blended transition is not required. This is what This is to have a detectable warning surface. This is what Jeremy was referring to before, and it's a change from the NPRM. And as Jeremy mentioned, really what's critical is to have a consistent policy with regard to how this is handled throughout the county. Okay, now quick wrap up. A few reminders before we move on to the Q&A. First, it's very important to remember that PROWAG establishes just minimum standards. You need to comply with these requirements, but doing only the minimum doesn't mean the design is accessible. And an example of that is a 4-foot wide sidewalk with 5-foot passing spaces in a downtown area or near a school where there's high pedestrian traffic. That's not an accessible sidewalk, because crowded sidewalks can be very challenging for people with disabilities to navigate. Second, PROAG doesn't cover everything related to accessibility. We mentioned this earlier. There are things that aren't covered or not covered in depth. Non-conventional designs such as floating bus stops and shared streets are not covered. It also doesn't cover stuff like sidewalk buffers and greenscape that do have a lot of benefits for people with disabilities. They're just not addressed in PROAG, not part of the minimum requirements. We'll be addressing some of these other requirements and some of these gaps in PROAG in the work that we're doing for MCDOT. We're developing an accessible design guide for MCDOT, and there will soon be a draft of that available. I'm sure that some of you will be reviewing. So that's an attempt to make PROAG central and kind of the baseline, but also address some of the gaps in PROAG. And a final note that engaging people with disabilities in planning and design processes for temporary and permanent projects, both of those, is critical, especially for projects that include non-conventional designs. And a phrase that you often hear in the disability community is "nothing for us without us," and that really applies, and it's very important to remember when designing pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way. And with that, I will open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, so the first question that we had in the chat was, do detectable warnings across driveways apply only if there are stop or yield signs, or if they are stop or yield control, which would be essentially every driveway? The wording in PROAG is driveways controlled with yield or stop control devices. And so that is interpreted to mean only those that include the actual sign. It also specifies those that are included within traffic signals similarly need to have those detectable warnings. And then Matt noted the question he asked the access board about the meter height, and that, yeah, even if you're not charging, you still need to have compliant meters. I believe in our interpretation of reading PROAG, it also notes that although not directly in the discussion of accessible parking spaces, but notes that things that need to be used by any person need to be accessible. So in the same way that a drinking fountain needs to be accessible to a person in a wheelchair, our interpretation of the reading was that all parking meters need to be accessible to a person with a disability. So that's another sort of reason why those pay stations are preferable to the individual parking meters, because a person in a wheelchair is not going to be able to see those higher placed parking meters, whereas the pay stations tend to be fully accessible. And then Andrew's asking a question about the orientation of the curb ramp shown in our graphic. So there's no dimension shown for that curb ramp, so I'll throw a few caveats in here. First and foremost is there's a requirement that you have a 48-inch clear space at the bottom of a curb ramp, so that orientation would be permitted if that marked buffer is at least big enough to accommodate that 4-foot by 4-foot landing. And then I'll further note that again, the 13 by 24-inch parking space is already dimensioned to account for both the space for the vehicle and the accessible route along and either in front of or behind the vehicle. So it's also possible that that may be accounted for by that vehicle parking towards the end of the block and then having enough space to access the ramp. But yes, we definitely need to be deliberate in the configuration of curb ramps accessing these accessible parking or loading spaces to ensure that they can be fully accessible. And then where can we find copies of the standards that you showed us for curb ramps? So if you're referring to just where would you find PROWAG in general, PROWAG's accessible from the U.S. Access Board's webpage. I think it's usaccess.gov/PROWAG, but that's all provided there. One thing of note is that currently the Access Board, at least I didn't check this morning, so I could be wrong, but up until now, their guidance has not included any images of figures or graphics, unlike their previous drafts. Jim had reached out to the Access Board, and they did say that they were going to be adding graphics, quote, ASAP, which was a few months ago. So hopefully we'll be seeing that soon. But currently, it's just text on the Access Board's website.
So Matt provides a clarification related to the accessible parking space calculations, just mentioning that the accessible spaces can be provided on a different street than where you're making a modification.
Yeah, and that's a common design option, that if you're doing a separated bike lane on one street, it's going to be more challenging to do a accessible parking space along that separated bike lane unless you have a decent amount of width, whereas locating it to the adjacent side street can help to address that.
And then there's a question about from Joseph about whether PROAG is an addendum to the federal ADA standards and guidelines. And the way it worked was actually the ADA standards that we all know that are for buildings. When those came out, there was actually some additional chapters that were included that addressed the public right of way. And those were later pulled. This was in the proposed version of that regulation. They were pulled because of all the comments that were received back, and the access.
I think we've lost him.
Seems like Jim has frozen. Hopefully he will join us again here in a second. But essentially, PROAG is a building block of accessible design. So it is giving us design guidance specific to construction and alterations in the public rights of way. So rather than trying to have to apply the building related design guidance to stuff that's occurring in the right of way, we now have separate documents to address each unique condition. Are there other questions that folks have? Please feel free to come off mute. Happy to have a discussion about any of the topics that we presented or any other accessibility questions that you all have.
I guess I'm wondering if we know like what Montgomery County standards are right now. Does the code cite? Would this require a code update, or do we cite PROAG? Andrew.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's a me question. I think it varies depending on what you're talking about. I think some things we're doing quite well at, and I think I saw Michael Paylor's on the call. Like I think we're pretty good at the signals. Might be some small changes we need to do, but I think by and large our ramp design or signal design, I believe, is generally in the right ballpark. But from what I see, I think the ADA parking spaces, that for sure, we're not doing that at all, and that's going to require, I don't know, well, that might need some code changes based on what we put onto new developments. I don't know that we really have a clear mechanic. I think I see Sam Fahardy also on here, a clear mechanic to require them to do ADA spaces if they're providing on-street spaces. Then there's also the design standard is we don't really know what to tell them to build yet. We have this guidance at this point, but we haven't turned it into our own standards to give to somebody to build. I see hands going up and cameras turning on, so I'll step back.
Yeah, Matt, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up and say that we are currently working with Tool Design with Jim to create basically an ADA guide, accessibility guideline document for the county to help guide how we're asking developers and how we're designing things to be accessible. One thing that was also not, I don't think, I might have missed Jeremy, but I don't think you mentioned, that was kind of a surprise to me, and this came up at the ADA training that the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center held, I guess, last week up in Howard County, is that one of the new requirements, and this is a place where we are not going to be compliant, is when signals are on flash, the APS must indicate the condition to pedestrians. So, when you push the button, it would need to say, signals are flashing yellow for Georgia Avenue and flashing red for Spring Street or whatever. And there was a guy from Polera who was actually there who said, like, look, the APSs are actually powered through the head signal circuits, which are deactivated when the signal's on flash. There's literally no power to them, and there's not a good solution right now. So I think, it's one place where we're going to have to figure out how to do it. A lot of people are going to have to figure out how to do it, but that's a big change.
Yeah, I saw Peter Kuntz had posted that on the ITE listserv, and people were like, I don't know how we would accomplish that right now. And then when do you think they will require enforcement of PROAG? From what we've heard, it's conflicting information. So currently, USDOT does have a message on their website noting that it will be in their legislative priorities for 2024 to have that posted in the Federal Register. I had previously heard that it would be sooner than that. So I think we're expecting it, if it is in 2024, potentially earlier in the year, but yeah, they have not given an exact timeline. And then we've not heard anything direct from DOJ, though what Jim had mentioned before was they may potentially take a little bit longer, longer than the US DOT. I'd further reinforce, though, what we were talking about before, that regardless of their enforceability, the ADA in general requires that, facilities in the public rights of way to be accessible. And given that this represents the current best guidance related to minimum requirements for accessibility, regardless of that enforcement piece, that we should still be using it as our building block for doing construction, particularly knowing that the DOT and DOJ cannot diminish. They can give more strict guidance. I wouldn't expect that, but it's possible that they could. But it means that if we're building something that's not in compliance with PROAG today, that once it is adopted and enforceable, then when we make alterations, we're going to have to change what we've just constructed. So even that question about, if a project's at 95%, do we have to comply with this? Well, if we can quickly and reasonably modify certain elements of design to do that, then I would suggest that we should be doing it. So simple things like, should we install detectable warnings on a stop controlled driveway? That's not going to take much time to make those changes. Whereas the accessible parking spaces one may be it's difficult in certain conditions. So, take it on a case by case basis.
But at the
Sam
same
Farhad.
time, at the same time, though, the issue is that DOT could adopt more strict rules. So we could make modifications based on exactly what PROAG says right now, and then find out that, well, DOT says it's actually got to be a little bit different, and so it still might be non-compliant, which is the frustrating part of waiting for these rules to come out.
So Sam has his hand raised.
Yes, hi. I just I'm curious, and this may or may not be applicable to this presentation, but I mean, I see that this PROAG, the way you presented it, is mostly about the technical design of individual ramps, individual parking spaces, so on and so forth. I did not see anything about general layout and how the sidewalk fits within the whole scope of the project and the impact of that to the disabled users of the sidewalk. For example, we have cases that we have a development which is infill, and there's a requirement for them to construct sidewalk along their frontage that does not connect to any existing facility on either side. And my understanding was this kind of construction is not ADA compliant because it leads to nowhere. And again, this is just an example. I'm just wondering if there's anything in PROAG that would apply to cases like that.
So PROAG refers to things when they are altered. So if we're not altering things, then PROAG does not require compliance. But in the case that you're describing, if you're building a new site and altering the street, then that street should have an accessible route. And there are going to be different scenarios. So a developer is building a sidewalk and that sidewalk terminates at an intersection. Well, then that intersection would need to have a curb ramp that then connects across the roadway to a receiving curb ramp. And then that curb ramp might only access the push button and doesn't continue elsewhere. I've also seen, although PROAG doesn't have this guidance, that many agencies will require a developer to extend a sidewalk to a logical, reasonable terminus. So sometimes that does mean extending the sidewalk beyond their frontage if that would make a connection for that accessible route. And if that requires coordination with an adjacent property owner, then that would need to be done and documented. So I do think it varies on a case-by-case basis, but PROAG simply says that things need to be compliant when they're altered.
Okay, so I guess it would be very difficult to make a general guidance and finding about whether that which is the lesser of the two evils, whether to build a sidewalk and end it or not to build it at all, and because it cannot be compliant. And again, and my understanding is, please correct me if I'm wrong, that if you build a sidewalk that does not connect to existing facility is essentially non-compliant. Is this correct?
I don't think that's correct. I think there are, we did mention some cases where PROAG does require a pedestrian access route connection. For example, in the case of in the case of a transit stop or accessible parking space, there needs to be a pedestrian access route that connects to a pedestrian circulation path. But there isn't a requirement in PROAG that requires sidewalks to connect to each other or requires construction of sidewalks in the first place. It just doesn't cover that.
Yeah, so it doesn't require you to build a sidewalk, but if you're going to build one, it needs to be constructed with the appropriate widths, grades, and slopes, even if it's not currently connecting to a more continuous route.
Okay, thank you.
And Sam, we didn't touch on things like the minimum requirements for a sidewalk or pedestrian accessible route and for like width, and that's because that did not change from the previous draft, but PROAG does still require that the minimum width for a sidewalk be 4 feet. And if you are building at that bare minimum, which we don't recommend and doesn't really align with the county's complete streets policy, but if you are doing 4-foot wide sidewalks, it means we need to have a 5-foot by 5-foot passing area at least every 200 feet. But again, pointing out, if you were building to that requirement, that would mean somebody in a wheelchair who sees another person in a wheelchair approaching would have to sit and wait in that passing area until that other person in the wheelchair could reach them, which 200 feet at 3.5 feet per second is 60 seconds or 57 some odd seconds. So to Jim's point about designing to the greatest accessibility, PROAG is just giving you the bare minimums, but doesn't always mean that it's going to be the most comfortable or accessible facility. So going above and beyond that and ensuring that we're providing at least 5-foot wide sidewalks so that passing can happen wherever it naturally, organically would happen, that's going to be the more preferred design.
So Matt has his hand up. Matt?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that one thing that I mentioned earlier. This came up at the discussion we had at the Mid-Atlantic Community Center as well, which is that right now, the issue I brought up before about the pedestrian signals when the signals are on flash, right now that is prohibited. The manual on uniform traffic control devices says thou shalt not have any pedestrian signal message play when the signals are on flash. And PROAG is going to require it. So we're going to have it like, even this is again like trying to do PROAG before it gets adopted. Is if we do it right now, we can't do it until the rule changes. And so it's really, it can be, a lot of this is going to be frustrating and it's going to be a learning curve, but yeah, I hope that we can get some more guidance from the access board as things develop.
My understanding is that the people who were writing PROAG and the people who were writing the MUTCD, the updated MTCD, were closely collaborating to make sure that that what was being brought over to PROAG was consistent with as much as possible with what was expected to come out in the updated MUTCD. So hopefully that holds. Although there's always the opportunity or the possibility that they won't align exactly. And I think in that case, I think it's up to there may be a process where they're to align them more closely.
Awesome.
Any other questions that folks have? We still have plenty of time.
If not, really appreciate Jim and Jeremy, your time and your perspective. And I really thank everyone who took the time to participate today to learn about this topic. It's obviously a very important topic for the county and in helping us achieve the goals in the pedestrian master plan and the county's Vision Zero policy, and to help us implement Thrive and the Complete Streets vision laid out in the Complete Streets design guide. So I'm going to post this recording and some other information early next week. I'll send it out to everyone who RSVP'd one way or the other for this webinar. And if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to me, and I could sort of guide the questions to the appropriate folks. So thanks again. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks
all.
Yeah, thank you both. This is very helpful.
Thank you.